Hello and welcome back to another video. This is Jennifer McGuire and I hope you're having a good week. Today I'm going to share with you several embossed watercolor lift techniques. Now that sounds complicated, but it's super easy. I love the look of watercolor backgrounds, but I'll be honest, watercolor scares me. So I like to take the easy way and use products that I have. By combining it with heat embossing and then removing some of the color from the background, you can create some beautiful textures that make for simple cards. Now, I have several examples to show you, several variations, and if you want to learn more, I have links to other videos of similar techniques up here on the top right and in my YouTube description below, so you can check those out too. I think the best way to understand this technique is to just dive in, so let's start with this example. Okay, so I have Tim Holtz watercolor paper. I choose the Tim Holtz watercolor paper because it's a bright white paper and I get good results with it, but you definitely could use any watercolor paper that you may have. I'm taping two pieces onto a board so it stays flat as I'm creating, and then I can pick it up and move it aside to dry. Also, by doing two at a time, I'm saving time. To create my watercolor background, I decided to use Tombow markers. These are really easy to create backgrounds with, and I use them for a variety of techniques. Well, what I did here is I scribbled some of the marker onto my glass work surface, added some water to it, and then I'm painting it onto my paper. And I'm using a pretty generous amount of water. When I want to switch colors, I just wipe off my glass mat, scribble down some more color, pick it up with a wet brush, and add it to my paper. You can make this as dark or as light as you want, but I think it's best to start with a good amount of color for this technique. I chose to use water-based markers for this first example, but I'll show you some other things that you can use to create your watercolor background throughout this video. I actually didn't even use real watercolor, but you definitely could try what watercolors you may have. I wanted to show you could get more from many of your markers and many of your inks by doing this technique. So I continued to add different shades of blue and teals to my background. You could do other ways of adding this watercolor look that would be a lot faster. I could have just scribbled the marker onto my watercolor paper and added water. Or I could have put a lot of marker on my glass surface, sprayed it with water, and kind of dragged my paper through it. But I kind of wanted to play a little bit with the brush, so I chose to do this method. Whatever works best for you, you just want to put down a watercolor background with a good amount of color. I continued to add the color until I was happy with the results, and then you want to dry this completely. You can either set it aside to dry for a long time, or you can heat set it, which I do because I'm lazy, but you want to make sure that it's completely dry. Okay, so now it's time to do some heat embossing. I decided to use the new Hero Arts Nordic holiday stamp. It's a beautiful design and very unique. Now, to stamp with this, you could either just lay the stamp upside down onto your work surface, ink it up, and then lay your paper onto it. But I decided to use my Misty stamping tool. I wanted to show you a trick of how to center the image up on your paper. So I put some adhesive on the back of my watercolor piece, and now I'm putting my stamp into my Misty. I'm going to center my watercolor piece right onto the stamp. So I have a little bit of adhesive facing up towards the camera right now. I then am going to close my Misty upside down onto it and press down, flip it back over and open. And now my watercolor piece is temporarily adhered to the inside of my Misty so that when I stamp that big image on it, it'll be centered. Now I'm going to use anti-static powder tool. You want to use that generously because we want to get a clean image. And I'm inking up my stamp with Versamark ink, which is just a clear sticky ink. When we stamp this, you won't see it. That's okay. It'll show up when we add our embossing. This is Hero Arts clear embossing powder. Any clear embossing powder would work. And I'm adding that onto our background, being sure to tap off the excess. Once I've got it completely covered, I'll heat set that. You'll see a shiny image on your watercolor, but it really looks like the same color or same intensity as the background, but we're going to change that. I'm taping it back onto my board just to keep it flat, and now I'm applying water, just plain water, Actually, my water is a little bit dirty, but it doesn't matter. You just want to apply a generous amount of water over your background. This will reactivate any of that color that is exposed. So now I'm going to wipe it away with a dry cloth and check out how the background is getting lighter, but the color underneath the heat embossing is staying how it originally was since it's trapped under it. So we're basically lifting color from around the embossed areas. You can add as much water as you want and wipe away as much color as you want to get a softer background. It almost looks suede when you look at it up close. Now let's finish off this card before I show you more variations of the technique. I decided to use the Hero Arts Nordic tree stamp and die. I thought this was a perfect match for the background and such a beautiful, simple image that can be used in many ways. I decided to silver heat emboss it on white cardstock, but I've got a trick for you that I wanted to show you. I actually double heat embossed this. So I heat embossed it once with silver ink, then I put it back into my MISTI in the same spot, used my anti-static powder tool again, stamped with Versamark ink right on top of the embossing we've already done. Then I add another layer of silver embossing. This gives us a bit more dimension and it creates a more smooth image. And for something like this, I think it makes a huge difference. I'll then use the coordinating die to cut it out. Ignore the sentiment that I heat embossed there. I decided to use it on a project later, so stay tuned for that. Okay, I also used the tree die to cut from a piece of white craft foam so that it would have dimension when I glue it behind the stamped tree. Now for the sentiment, I used the Hero Arts Greetings Christmas Messages stamp set. This is a small stamp set with a great price point, with lots of different holiday messages. I wanted to do this celebrate the season, but I wanted it to be longer, not stacked. So I'm using my scissors to carefully cut the words apart. I will then line them up with the grid on my MISTI, and then I can put paper into my MISTI and stamp it, and that way we'll have celebrate the season long instead of stacked. Whenever I want to use it as it was originally intended, the stacked look, I can just mount it that way into my MISTI or my acrylic onto an acrylic block. So after I silver heat emboss that, I'm just trimming down that message so I can add it onto our card under the tree. So I glued my tree die cut onto the tree craft foam piece, and then I will add that onto my card, and I'm using liquid adhesive for that. I like to use liquid adhesive on my pieces because I can kind of wiggle it around and make sure it's straight. So for this sentiment strip, I put a piece of craft foam on the back of it. But again, I want to use liquid adhesive so I can move it. So what I do is I remove the release paper from the foam tape, put liquid adhesive onto that sticky foam tape, and then I can move it around and it'll have the dimension, it'll stay put, and I have the flexibility to make sure it's straight. I then use my jewel picker to add Lucy's Card silver gems here and there on the tree. And then I have a pretty pink posh silver star that I decided to add to the top with one gem on top of that. So there's lots of sparkle on that tree to catch the eye. And then you have that fun background technique of watercolor lifting that gives a really unique look. So the heat embossing traps the original color, and then around the heat embossing, you can lift color away to make it look softer. Now you may have noticed that I had a stamped image on my envelope. And before we go to the next card example, I wanted to show you what that image is from. This is a new stamp set from the Stamping Village, which is a group of companies that work together collaborating on different things. So there are 12 different companies represented on this stamp set. These are holiday seals, so you can put them on your envelope or use them on your card. I decided to use these on my envelopes today. However, I have a video coming soon where I'll show you other ways to use this. The greatest thing about the stamp set, in addition to the collaboration between the companies, is that 100% of the net profits go to Dreaming Zebra, which is a wonderful organization that helps people experience art. Okay, remember how I created 2 watercolor backgrounds at once before? Well, we're going to use the second one for this next example, but I'm going to change things up a bit to create that textured look in the background. This background stamp is the Hero Arts Nevermore stamp. I like the fun and layered text on this image, and I thought it would be fun for the look of texture on the background of our card. So I'm going to do the same trick that I did before. Put adhesive on the back of my watercolor piece. Center it up on the stamp, so it's upside down on the stamp. Close the MISTI upside down, press and flip over. And that way I know that my watercolor piece is centered, or it's straight in this case. I'm inking this up with Tim Holtz Distress ink. Any ink that you have that reacts with water will work for this technique. Distress ink is perfect. So I'm stamping this onto my background, and it just gives a fun look of texture that'll look even better when we do the watercolor lift. I'm going to heat set this. You want to make sure it's completely dry before we go ahead and move on to the next step. So we have our MISTI set up with the Nordic background stamp. I'm generously using my anti-static powder tool and stamping the background with the clear Versamark ink. You really want to press down since this is a big background image. I then am once again adding clear embossing powder. This will trap some of the color and some of the stamping underneath. I'll then heat set it, and it's time to do the watercolor lift technique. So again, I've taped it onto a board, and I'm going to add a generous amount of water on this, and I'll show a few variations of this later. I like to repeat this process a few times where I add water and then remove it with a dry cloth, then add a little more water and remove it again. Each time you take away a little more color from the unembossed areas, which makes the background softer and gives it that suede look. And because we added that stamping in there, you get this textury look. It almost looks like linen when you're done because of the stamp that I chose. Okay, so once I'm done and happy with the background, I can go ahead and heat set it so that it's dry. I also wanted to show you a close-up look of this background and the one we did earlier, so you can see the difference between the two that we get by doing that bit of stamping before the embossing. Okay, let's turn this into a card. I used the Hero Arts Christmas message die. This says Merry Christmas with a little holly, but I am cutting away the word Christmas and just using the word Merry. I die cut it 3 times from white cardstock, trimmed it down to just the word Merry, and glued them on top of each other for a stacked look. This makes a big difference when you have a busy background like this. By giving it that dimension, it makes the word Merry stand out more instead of getting lost against the background. I also added a few holly leaves and berries. The holly leaves are from that same die. The berries I used are enamel dots from Hero Arts. These are new, and check out the beautiful color combinations that are available. The reason I like these is because there are 3 sizes of enamel dots, which I always like to use, the 3 different sizes. And the smallest size is super small, and they're not very bulky. So I was excited to get these. They're all these color packs, plus clear ones. I decided to use the white, the 3 different sizes of white on today's card, just to stick to that white and bluish green colored look. You could do red berries if you wanted to. I also white heat embossed one of the holiday seals on my matching envelope. So here's a closer look at that background. You can see how we get the look of texture thanks to the background stamp that we stamped underneath the clear embossing. This is just a fun way to change up the look of any different background stamps that you may have. If you don't have background stamps, you could always use individual images and just repeatedly clear emboss them over your watercolor background before doing the lift technique. Okay, my next example demonstrates that inks can often be great for this technique. I decided to start with Tim Holtz Distress ink. These inks react with water and create wonderful watercolor looks, so I figured it would be perfect to try for this. I am just very quickly applying Seedless Preserves, Wilted Violet, Chip Sapphire, and Blueprint Sketch ink onto my watercolor paper. Notice it's kind of a hot mess. That's okay. I'm going to come in with some water and just move it around to create a watercolor look on the background. Once I'm happy with it, I'll go ahead and heat set it until this is completely dry. You can also do this with Distress Oxide inks and many other dye inks that you may have. Just give them a try. Later in this video, I'll also show you how well this works with Hero Arts reactive inks. Once I dried that, I wanted to show you a trick that I often do. I had pretty bad warping of my paper because I used so much water. To flatten it out before moving on to turning it into a card, I sometimes run that through a laminator, a heated laminator, just to flatten it. It makes it easier to stamp on it for this next step. Okay, this is the Hero Arts Noel background stamp. I thought this was really beautiful, detailed kind of cursive background. The look with this with watercolor lift will be different. Before, we had large areas of embossing, so you could see the darker color behind it. In this case, you'll still get that look, but it's really more about the texture, since this is a fine, detailed background stamp. So after I clear heat embossed it, I'm adding water to this very generously. This time, instead of using water in a brush, I'm using a water mist bottle. I spray it generously with water and then wipe that away with a clean cloth. Notice I do this several times because this was a pretty dark background, so I have a lot of color to lift. When you heat set this and dry it, the background actually will intensify. It'll lighten up and you'll see more contrast between the background and the heat embossed areas. Now, when I have a colorful, busy background like this one, I like to use white die cuts on it to keep a very clean look. Over top of our background, I use the Hero Arts Snowflake pattern die. Now, I die cut this 3 times from white cardstock and glued them on top of each other for the stacked dimension. I then put glue on the back of that and added it to our watercolor background and put all of that on a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. For the sentiment, I used the new Hero Arts Merry Christmas banner die. Die cut that 3 times from white cardstock, glued them on top of each other, and then cut out little purple scraps, dark purple scraps, to put behind the opening of the letters, just so that the dark color would show through. I then added that onto the front of our card and just added a few gemstones here and there on the background. I did stamp one of the holiday seals onto my matching envelope, and there you can see the background that we get. So it has beautiful color, a little bit of texture under that die cutting, a lot to look at in that background. And I'll tell you, these backgrounds are fun to create, and really that's half of card making. Part of it is the joy of creating, and then part of it is the sending of the cards to make people happy. So I encourage you to give this a try with the products that you have. Here's another example of doing this technique with the fine detailed background stamp. And I again used Distress ink. I'm applying Chip Sapphire, Wilted Violet, Blueprint Sketch, and Seedless Preserves to the background. And you can see I'm putting down a pretty generous amount of ink. You could even go direct to paper if you want to save time. I then sprayed that with water and heat set it to give it a little bit more of a watercolor look. You could definitely skip that and just do the inking itself, skip the water, and then heat set it. For the heat embossing, I'm using the Hero Arts Winter Village stamp. It's a background stamp that actually coordinates with this peekaboo die. So if you stamp it and then use this die, there's little windows that open up, little flaps. But I'm just using the stamp itself. So I'm centering the stamp in my MISTI with my paper, using my anti-static powder tool, stamping with Versamark ink, and then clear heat embossing, as I've done many times in this video. So now it's time to lift some color, so I'm spraying it generously with water. You can see the color moving. Distress inks react with water so well, so they're great for this technique. I then dab away the color and repeat that process until I have a background that I like. Remember, when you heat set this or dry it, the background will soften a bit. So here is the finished card. I did stamp one of the holiday seals on my matching envelope, and I used the Hero Arts Holiday Message die for that simple greeting in the center. This is actually a pretty quick card to make. You do the background, add the die cut, and put it onto a card. I also did add a few little iridescent gemstones in the background. Okay, here's another example. I just wanted to show you can really go bright with the colors on this technique. I went back to using the Tombow markers just because I had them out, but you definitely could use the Distress inks for this. And I did a bunch of different colors in the background. Once it was dry, I used my anti-static powder tool, and I'm stamping the Nevermore background stamp with Versamark ink, and then adding the clear embossing powder to trap some of that watercolor behind it. I wanted to mention there are a few ways to add water to remove the color. You can spray with a water bottle. You can use a brush to brush the water on. Another great thing that you can do is use a baby wipe. so that you can really remove a lot of the color, and you can see on the white baby wipe when the color stops lifting. So you can see the fun background we get here. We really lightened up the background and left the text to be a bit darker. Next, I wanted to show you how I created this little Celebrate the Season label die cut. It's what I made earlier, but I saved it for this card. This is the Hero Arts Nesting Rounded Rectangle die set. You can see I use it often. The smallest die in this set is actually a fun label that you can adjust to make any size you want. So I white heat embossed Celebrate the Season, and I'm cutting the label die up against one side of that sentiment. I'll run that through my die cut machine, and then I will reposition the die so that the other side is cut close to the sentiment also. So you can really make this longer via partial die cutting or shorter using the technique I have here. So you don't always have to have a bunch of label dies, or you don't always have to cut your sentiments to be rectangles. You can create your own label shapes. Also on this card, I used the Hero Arts Snowflake Cluster die. I die cut it 3 times from white cardstock and stacked them. Added our little sentiment label with some foam tape, and then also added some of the Hero Arts white enamel dots. So it's a pretty simple card design, and one that you can change up the background very easily to be different background stamps or different colors. Okay, with the other pink and purple watercolor piece that I created, I did this card here. This one features the Hero Arts ornament die set, the Poinsettia ornament die set. It has the outline shape of an ornament and the inside cutting piece, so you can use them together or separately. Now, I created this background using the watercolor lift technique with the Hero Arts Arch Pattern background stamp, but it was kind of busy when I tried to turn it into a card, and there was an area to the right where I didn't heat emboss well. Now, instead of starting over, letting this go to waste, I decided to use part of the background, and I'm actually filling my white ornament die cut with that pattern. So I glued the ornament on top, and I'm trimming away the excess, and I can even use the scraps on another card. I also die cut piece from glitter cardstock, put that right on top of the ornament, and then added this onto a note card. You can see I put some silver string on top, which I'll just fold over the back, temporarily tape down, and add some liquid adhesive that will dry. Once that's dry, I can trim the excess away and it'll hold tight. So here's a look at the final card. Now on the background, I did use the Hero Arts Noel stamp, and I stamped it with light purple ink on a purple note card. I also used the Holiday Seals stamp set to add the seal onto our matching envelope. So there you can see the watercolor lift technique in the background of the ornament. If you find there's a piece that you don't love, or you messed up part of it, just use part of your background. You can get creative and use up your scraps in many ways. Okay, for my last couple examples, I wanted to show you that you can add shimmer to these backgrounds. It is so hard to see in the video and in these photos, but this background has like a soft gold shimmery look to it that's gorgeous in real life. To do this, I took Distress Ink Antique Linen and applied it heavily onto watercolor paper. Believe it or not, when you add shimmer to this, it turns into gold look. I used the Sukaneko Shimmer Spritz. This has lots of sparkle to it, and I just sprayed it all over my piece and heat set it. You can also create your own shimmer mist by adding Perfect Pearl pigment powder to water in a water bottle and spray that instead. Once I dried that, I went ahead and stamped and clear heat embossed the Nordic background stamp on top. So we're trapping some of that gold look underneath the heat embossing. So now I'm spraying water on it so that I can lift the surrounding ink away. Now it's hard to see, but I did add shimmer to this once done. So I sprayed some shimmer on it at the end and heat set it. So this background is shiny. It's a little bit more intense under the heat embossing, but it's just gorgeous in real life. It's got this soft gold look to it that I wish you could see. Now on this, I added a Hero Arts paper layering poinsettia die cut. So I put these together with liquid adhesive and foam tape, so there was some dimension to it. And I created that dimensional flower and a few leaves. And then there's even the die to create the centerpiece for that, which I did from gold glitter cardstock. I added a little sentiment strip and also some gold jewels from Lucy's cards. Again, I wish you could see the shimmer, but this spritz is a great way to add a little more interest to the watercolor lift backgrounds. This is a soft gold look. If you want a soft silver look, you can either use pumice stone distress ink or hickory smoke distress ink. Okay, my last example is one of my favorites because it's so easy to create. In this case, I'm using Hero Art's reactive inks, which are fantastic for this technique, and you'll see why it's so easy. So I'm starting with watercolor paper, and these are Hero Art's reactive inks, and I am just going direct to paper and adding a pretty heavy amount of ink over the background. I'm doing different blues and teals in different spots until all of the white is covered. I am not taking any time to blend this. And the cool thing about these inks is they kind of blend on their own. So you'll see that you get a really nice blended look without any effort. I went ahead and heat set that, used my anti-static powder tool, and now I am stamping the graphic Snowflake stamp with Versamark ink and adding clear embossing powder to that. Notice that I didn't use water before my clear embossing to make a watercolor background. You can always skip that if you want. Now I'm spraying this generously with water and check out how quickly the color reacts. Instead of wiping away the excess color with a cloth, you can also press a piece of watercolor paper on it and use that for another watercolor background. In fact, I have a really cool technique video that I'll link to here where you can do like a mono print and get two backgrounds from once with this technique. Okay, so once I've softened the background as much as I want, I go ahead and heat set it with my heat gun, and then I did miss some of that shimmer spritz on top so that it'll have some shimmer in real life. I used a lot of different background stamps and techniques today, so I hope it demonstrates that this technique works with a lot of stuff you probably have. Okay, to finish off this card, I used the Hero Arts Merry Christmas die set. So this comes with that detailed inside frame, and then you also have the frame die cut you can use with or without it. I die cut that 3 times from white cardstock and glued them on top of each other and added that to our background in a note card. I also added a few iridescent gems in the center there to look like snowfall, but other than that, I added nothing else. So it's a very simple design that allows that background to show through. So I hope this video inspires you to try different variations of a color lifting technique. Really, there are many products that work for this, so just experiment. If you're interested in the particular products I used today, they are linked below in my YouTube description, but my blog has a lot more information for you, so I encourage you to head there. And you can do so by clicking up here on the top right. In the middle are a couple other lifting videos that I think you might like also. I appreciate that you stopped by and spent some time with me today, and we'll see you again soon. Have a wonderful week.